11.6, designing your own exceptions. Now, obviously the library of exceptions is pretty exhaustive, but at times you're going to want specific ones for your code because you want your exceptions to be as specific as possible. So, if you had, for instance, in this case, an insufficient funds exception, you would want that to be thrown instead of just having sort of the generic runtime, maybe an illegal argument exception or a runtime exception. Those are a little vague and it might not be obvious where the problem lies. Now, if I have the statement if amount is greater than balance, we will report an insufficient funds exception in the withdrawal method of our bank account. Now we'll say that this should be an unchecked exception because technically you should handle whether or not the balance is greater than, or the withdrawal amount is greater than the balance before you actually go ahead and call the withdrawal method, but we'll go ahead and run with it. So if amount is greater than my balance, throw a new insufficient funds exception with the parameter a method of the string withdraw of the parameter amount exceeds the balance of your current bank balance. Okay. So again, we'll assume in this case this will be a checked. Most of them we're going to assume will be checked. Most of your exceptions will be checked. This one's unchecked. We're also going to assume the program would have properly handled any erroneous coding and wouldn't generate unchecked exceptions. Although for this example, it would be. User-defined exceptions. You will be a subclass of the class exception, which are checked, or a class of runtime exception. Those are unchecked. So if you look at Figure 1 on page 504, the sort of darker color ones in that picture are checked exceptions, and all the lighter ones are unchecked exceptions. So we want to generate a message. It's customary to give two constructors because now that we've written we're going to throw our new insufficient funds exception with the problem of when we go to compile it, we're going to get an error. The computer has no idea what an insufficient funds exception actually is. So we have to write insufficient funds exception. So generally you're going to give yourself at least two things. One, a default constructor, and then a constructor that gives some sort of a string message describing the reason for the exception. So in this case, public class insufficient funds exception extends runtime exception. So we said this should be an unchecked exception because you should check that your balance is able to handle your amount, but we're going with it. So it extends the unchecked runtime exception. And public insufficient funds exception default constructor right here, nothing in it. And then I spelled it wrong, insufficient funds exception with a string message. And I just get to, no sense in rewriting how to print the message, I'll just throw it to my superclass and output the message. Now one thing you do want to be careful of is you want to throw specific exceptions. Now while this is a subclass of runtime exception, I would not want to throw a runtime exception in this case, because that would trigger all sorts of other ones. I could get null pointers, array out of bounds exceptions, and then it's going to be really hard to figure out what my problem is. If I'm trying to run this program and the problem in the program is that my withdraw method is calling with an amount parameter that exceeds my balance, and all it's generating is a runtime exception, then you're going to have to go trace all of them. You're going to have to trace any array that you might have in your entire program and see, are you running out of bounds? Or, do you have a null pointer somewhere? Which is a lot more work than if you just, my withdraw method isn't working right. So be as specific as possible if you're going to write an exception.